So this kind of GIF shows the amount of different possible representations you find in handbooks, and we will see some of them. So how the presentation is structured. So performances. We will see this 7, at least, performance. First, from building to text. Second, from individual to collective knowledge. Third, from form to norm. Fourth, from readers to respondents. 5, from plan to trace. 6, from plan to list. 7, from design to composition. When Malise and Remy presented me their initiative, that was about this exercise that should have been done in 1 hour, it immediately came to my mind this book. This is also why I just gave the title to my lecture, EINE STUNDE HANDBÜCHER. This book is entitled EINE STUNDE Architectuur. And it is a very interesting book because it dates back to the 20s, and of course it was a very ideological book, but the performance of this book was very clear. It was supposed to be read in 1 hour by architects, and after this hour, those who read the book should have understood pretty clearly what modern architecture was. And it was, of course, not evident for people at the time. And so it is interesting to see that already from the beginning, from the cover, you have a certain communicative feature that is pretty clear. There is a clock in the background that indicates the time. And then you see that there is this terrace that is the Waisenhof in Stuttgart. And then there is this small picture of Saint Jerome with the lion on the side. And it is interesting to see that this picture comes from a very old representation, not very old, but a Renaissance one. And what we see here is that while in the Renaissance engraving, Saint Jerome is surrounded by many objects, the collage that was made by this author called Max Fischer, that was a friend of Adolf Bene, the author of the book. And we see that here there is no more this cabinet of books, but what is represented here is just what is essential. So there is a hat here, there is the stable. Basically the lion is very domesticated animal here, is mostly like a dog. And so basically the idea of the essential as architecture, modern architecture was supposed to get rid of all ornaments, get rid of stuff that didn't matter. So the essential was really, from the beginning, from the cover, something that was communicated. Bene wanted to communicate that making architecture is not that difficult. You can learn in 1 hour what a modern architecture is. And just by making corrections of older, previous, ancient buildings, like this Gothic castle that we see on the left, by getting rid of all ornaments, then you suddenly realize that you do have a modern building. You see, without ornament, just with this hole in a blank facade. The first example I would like to see relates to the so-called architectural treatise. What is the treatise? Basically, the treatise, first of all, is a book. And it pretends usually to tell what architecture is. The first treatise was Vitruvius, De Architectura, but the tradition of writing treatise started really from the Renaissance with Leon Battista Alberti, which wrote the Re Edificatoria. That is perhaps the first architectural treatise of, let's say, modern history. And but although we are used to define architectural treatises as historical objects, I would say actually they are not. Let's consider, for instance, these two examples. On the one side, on the left, we see the Re Edificatoria, and then on the right, I placed the Architecture of the City by Aldo Rossi. Why I placed these two books, one on the side of the other? because I think they are very, very much similar. I would say the architecture of the city actually is a treatise, because they don't really tell us how to make architecture, but they pretend to say what is architecture, or in the case of Leon Battista Alberti, or to a larger scale, what is the city. So what treatises do is a discourse on architecture. So they really focus on a thing that is the text. But before we see how these books are made, it is important to note that the authors are usually individual authors. They are in the so-called intellectuals. And this is actually the particularity of the treatise, for instance, in relation, if we compare them with handbooks. Because the treatise are those books that provide the point of view of a single human being. In this case, the Edificatoria provides the point of view of Leon Battista Alberti, and the architecture of the city is the point of view of Aldo Rossi. They don't negotiate their point of view. This is just what they have in mind. How the treaties are made. Now we go really straightforward to the performativity. Basically, treaties, they are made of text. So they basically translate buildings into text. And this has historical reasons, of course. The reproduction of images and drawings was not that easy at the time where Leon Battista Alberti lived. So, of course, there were technical difficulties, but somehow there are other authors nowadays that think that these intellectuals didn't want really to provide their ideas with a very easy to reproduce effect. So they wanted a bit to hide their own figurative repertoires. But if we go to the question is how can we translate a building into a text? Well, here we see really the treatise had to face this issue. It was not evident, of course. Because there is not, of course, a one-to-one correspondence between the two things, but in order to make them converge towards a common meaning, you have to build an overall system of concepts. And this is not actually something that related only to architecture, but it is important to stress that to a larger scale, and even though in the previous century, then like here we see Ptolemy, other people like geographer has to face the same issue. Ptolemy, for instance, wanted to translate the shape of the earth, how the description of the earth into a book. What he did, basically, he used coordinates. So that was his idea. Now we go back to one issue that I just mentioned previously, but how a single man can do this huge work. I mean, it is definitely not evident. So I would say that in order to undertake such an effort, authors have to create a sort of fiction. They don't really look for an agreement with a community, but they try to find a way by which this fiction can become somehow can be understood by someone, and eventually it can become a face, something you can believe in. So they don't really look for respondents, but these people, in order to make their theory, let's say, effective, these people try to create an audience of, let's call them believers. That's the point. And how this, let's say, effort takes place? Well, there is a very interesting concept that is the one of dissimulation, which is, dissimulation basically is a modus operandi, is a way by which intellectuals at one point of history precisely in the Renaissance, starting from the Renaissance, they started to make, let's say, to produce an image of the world that was not the one that was evidently perceived by people. And this image, this picture you see here in the background comes from a very interesting short story that was written by Manetti, that was a Renaissance storyteller, let's call it like that. And this story is called The Fat Woodworker. And it is very interesting because also Brunelleschi, a very famous Renaissance Italian architect, was involved into this story. A group of intellectuals made a trick, basically, because they made this woodworker believe that he was someone else. And this is very interesting because at the end, this one really believes he is someone else. So I think this story tells that the process that is not only taking place in the world of literature, but in a more larger environment that concerns also architecture. And therefore, to simplify, we can say that this is a strategy by which intellectuals turns the world into a system of concepts. Of course, concepts are literary and therefore word-based devices. And unfortunately, this kind of system of concepts has dramatic effect, like these bizarre, for instance, festivals, where people, in this case, we see here on the right, they are all architects, and they basically use these masks or these strange costumes which make them look like buildings because basically they identify themselves in a system of concepts that comes from a different environment. But this was only possible by means of a specific technique that is related to the text, that is rhetorics. Therefore, to sum up, I would say that in order to go from a building to a text, you have to build a very performative text that grasp and exploit all the possible, let's say, tools and devices from the domain of rhetorics. And this is usually driven by an individual, and it doesn't look for an overall agreement by a community, but it actually tries to produce effect in terms of an audience that believes that this is true. Now we go to the second, that is from individual to collective knowledge, but is also from God to reason. And I explicitly refer this condition to the encyclopedia. Perhaps you know that starting from the Enlightenment, intellectuals engage themselves with the domain of science. And perhaps the encyclopedia edited by Diderot d'Alembert is witness one of the huge, strongest efforts that were undertaken at the time in order to provide this image of knowledge with a certain layout. What is evident from the beginning is that we are no more faced with individual knowledge, but with collective knowledge. What we see here, for instance, in this picture, are the so-called philosophes, so groups of intellectuals with different, let's say, domain of interest, not only science, but also literature, music, arts, whatever, that discuss together. They have these cultural exchanges by which they want to arrive at a certain agreement upon a different domain of knowledge and possibly to the overall tree of knowledge. For these people, of course, there is no more God but reasons, simply because they don't think that there is a universal truth, but truth is something that should be negotiated. Therefore, if truth and knowledge is not just an outcome of a single mind. So it is very important that to recognize that the encyclopedia and the procedure of knowledge production that starts from the Enlightenment is based on two main phases. The first is that these people try to list what there is in the world. And second is to recognize these entities with certain features, like for instance motion, heat, colors, whatever. But in this process, where is the architect? The architect is first of all someone that looks and observes how the construction is undertaken. Therefore, in this picture, what we see, for instance, very well clearly highlighted is the image of someone that observes workers that are somehow engaged with their own activities. And this is most actually related to all fields of knowledge and of production. And what about the building? The building is no more a single domain of the architect, but is a very negotiated domain. The architect negotiates his knowledge with other technicians, with builders, with craftsmen. And this is very important to understand because he partly renounced to the power that he had, for instance, in the Renaissance, where he was very near to the power of God. In this, starting from the Enlightenment, knowledge is really negotiated among different domains of science as well. And it's very interesting to see in this picture the way the building is represented, which is just a structural skeleton. There are no more ornaments, proportions, whatever. And this is very eloquent of the kind of plates and representations you find in the encyclopedia and in the other also books starting from the Enlightenment period. What is evident as well is that architecture is no more at the center of the world, as it appeared in the architectural treatise previously. In order to frame architecture, you have to understand how it is placed in the overall structure of sciences. On the top here, we see that in the first edition of the encyclopedia, if I'm not wrong, the architect Blondel, that was a very famous architect at the time, writes the item architecture in 3 pages. While, on the other side, if the item agriculture is developed in 8 pages. So actually, we can see from this comparison that architecture is really dramatically reduced in its presence and perhaps its effectuality. So what happens to architecture? Where is architecture? It seems from the item and the description that we previously saw that architecture is almost disappeared, simply because we use categories that come from the past. But I would say that on the contrary, architecture is everywhere. Simply, we have to consider that architecture is no more left to the domain of building churches, building palaces for the noblesse, and building very representative building. But the encyclopedia shows that architecture, is dedicated to very technical objects. And we see architecture spread basically in the overall domain of craftsmanship. And this is very interesting because if we go like 20 years, let's say at the beginning of the 19th century, we see that the encyclopedia produced a huge effect on the way architecture was conceived. This is, for instance, a picture that is published in the very famous book by Jean-Baptiste Rondelet, which is still called treatise, but provides an extremely different image of architecture than the one that was, for instance, found in Leon Battista Alberti's De Re Edificatoria. Here, what receives a strong highlighting is the invisible, are all those invisible elements that are hidden within the structure in order to provide the structure with a certain strength. And I would say that in order to provide this theory with a precise and specific route, we should go back to Galilei. What we see with the borns of modern sciences, therefore with Galileo, is a completely different way of conceiving the building that does not more start from the building as a finite shape, but really start from the possibility of its failure. Therefore, it basically focuses on how the technical domain of architecture should be represented in order to provide architecture with an agreement with other sciences. Therefore, how architecture can become, in a way, a science itself. And now we arrive to the handbook. So only if we understand the process that brings from the treatise towards, the books that were published after the Enlightenment and the encyclopedia, we can understand why handbooks born. Because basically handbooks are interested in the technical mechanism that governs the domain of building. And so handbooks are that kind of books that attempts to provide these technicalities with something that can become a domain of science. Now we see another performativity that is from form to norm. Of course, the issue of the norm is does not born simply with handbooks, but is, of course, it relates to a previous period. And therefore, actually, if we think about the 5 orders of architecture, they were already an attempt, let's say, to provide the form with a certain norm, with a certain mathematic precision. Unfortunately, these kind of orders were mostly related to building like churches or very representative public buildings. Starting from the 17th century, we see that the norm starts to colonize also the domestic domain, therefore the domains of housing. And this is very interesting example that is Lemoy's treatise about how to build an apartment building in a city. And what is the norm about here? It is basically about how many rooms can be aligned in order to face the street. The book we see here is a very famous handbook that is Neufert's Bau- und Fußlehre, with architects' data or whatever it is called. Is perhaps the most diffused handbooks in the world. And here is no more the church with the orders or the house with the dimensions of the rooms. Here all the small furnitures that of which our daily life is composed is measured and reduced to a specific but at the same time very generic outcome. And so we went from the church, we see here, we achieved the city by the means of the house, and here we have the furniture. And if we go even to a smaller scale, we see that Neufer pretended to generalize the human being in itself. For instance, the average height and the best height in order to provide a certain correspondence with standards, the best height of the human being is 1.75 meters. And how Neufert achieves this measurement? Basically, he achieved this measurement by analyzing also how the human being performs his activities. And for instance, it is very interesting to compare the dimension of the human being and his hand with the bricklaying, the activity of bricklaying. So in order to basically generalize the overall world, is no more the human being. He does not consider the human being because of divine proportions or gods as a god invention, but rather the human being in its own ordinary activities. And especially those related to labor and bricklaying are the ones by which a unified system of measurement can be achieved. In terms of architecture, this is the kind of outcomes to which perhaps we arrive by the means of translating forms into norms. This is a kind of arrangement that we see in a handbook published in the 50s, where all the possible houses arrangement are represented by the means of grids and modules that are then gathered into logical arrangements. If we consider this handbook as relevant, let's say, publications in the domain of architecture, this is also due to a shift that occurs from the readers, therefore from the audience as a reader, to the audience as a respondent. Therefore, the question is, who reads handbook? Builders, for instance, are the main interlocutor, the main respondent of handbooks. Why? Simply because handbooks produce a fragmented image of the building. It is no more the finite square shape or whatever kind of typological building that is represented in handbooks, but we see that usually buildings are subdivided into their own fragments and elements. There is no more an overall image, but the image results from the synthesis of multiple details. So the builders are the first respondent of handbooks. Second respondents of handbooks are technicians in general. And really, architects, by means of handbooks, starts to understand first how buildings are made. So they really negotiate their let's say, legitimization of, let's say, a creator of buildings with other technicians. And this kind of fruitful exchange is achieves extremely interesting representations in handbooks, where we see here, for instance, these lithographs, which provide all the smaller details of plumbings and whatever of the house with a certain aesthetic arrangement that was previously only given to the building, to the finite building. So there is here a certain spectacularization of the details that afterwards became the so-called high-tech trend, high-technology trend, stuff like Richard Rogers buildings. But we really see here in the negotiation that takes place in handbooks, this first, let's say, coming up, highlighting of technicalities that achieves a certain aesthetic spectacularization. And then other respondents, of course, of handbooks are other architects, or rather architects that don't pretend to find, let's say, the root of architecture into a metaphysical or so-called God-coming image, or what a philosopher called Pentecostal image of architecture, but rather try to understand the historical development of architecture, something that started from spontaneous shapes and finally became a rational building, but also not as something that comes from an initial idea, but that is rather negotiated, and it's really a collective process that brings from the caverns towards the modern industrial and high-tech building. Then, perhaps another, let's say, very important in a way respondent of the handbook culture in general is the client. What we find for the first time here in handbooks, the building represented in terms of a representation for someone that is not an architect. Treaties are really addressed mostly to architects, therefore they work with orthogonal representations, they work with very conventionalized techniques of representation, while handbooks attempt to provide the representation of the building with a certain popular outcomes, and this is very much also highlighted by the presence of housing prices. And so this is very much a feature that is related to the handbook culture. Then we go to a further performance that is from plan to trace. It is really the subject of my PhD. Because what happens, starting from, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, is that the building achieves an abstract representation. I mean, in this kind of books, like the 5 that we see here that constitutes the main part, or let's say the research corpus of my PhD, are not common plans, but are these kind of figures which provide the building with a very abstract outcomes. Why? And I would say that perhaps things are getting too much complicated, and common plans, the one that, I mean, plans like these ones, for instance, made with that attempts to represent surfaces and wall thickness, this kind of ordinary plan are no more useful. And in order to provide complexity, functional complexity, as well as technological complexity, with a certain comprehensibility, it is important for them to shift their representation towards a more abstract one. In this book here that is entitled Iconografia, it is perhaps a very unique book in itself, in the sense that this book attempts to provide the history of plan, but he pretends to say that the diagram belongs to the domain of the plan, simply because it relates to the arrangement and the organization of the horizontal space. So, it is important to switch to the concept of trace, therefore to the so-called science of ichnology. Ichnos in Greek means trace. Ichnologists are those scientists that try to understand which living beings produced certain figures on surfaces. This picture we see, for instance, here represents the classical, let's say, ichnological reconstruction. If we reverse this image, I think we have a kind of a representation of how the plan works. Because the plan, if you think about it, is nothing else than an arrangement of walls on a certain ground with certain features. And this kind of attempt to provide this trace left by certain entities onto a ground, therefore the idea that the plan is able to record all these traces is a kind of a conceptual, let's say, device by which this author, that is Griffini, wants basically to stress that while recognize these traces allows the architect to produce the right arrangement of a house. What kind of traces I am talking about? Footsteps. The overall amount of analysis that takes place starting from the 20s on the house are based on the recognition of these traces as very important sources for the rearrangement of the so-called typological repertoires that were very much fixed throughout the tradition of architecture. And what we find here, for instance, in this tree picture, is a process of recognition of traces that wants to provide them with a certain order that starts from here on the left with a complete disorder, where you see that fluxes, where footsteps obstacle the one with each other, they interact in a very bad way. So here we have a second arrangement where the two things are somehow still confused, while in this final, let's say, rearrangement of rooms, here we see that the trays are more or less all put into order. It is in this process of corrections that takes place by means of trace recognition is very important. And there is this very interesting quote that comes from Thomas Bernard, that wrote this beautiful book entitled Correction, that says that we correct the result of the correction of a correction and so forth, but the ultimate correction is one we keep delaying. And this is something that really takes place in this kind of analytical process that brings from the bad arranged house towards a well arranged one. And what is very interesting in this kind of picture is precisely that we see the traces left by their own, represented for what they are. Here, I mean. Here what you see are just the traces of basically the paths undertaken by the inhabitants of the house from a room to another into different configurations. What this author wanted to demonstrate by this series of representation was that starting from a very disorganized, let's say, arrangement given to the very, let's say, confused paths, the one intersecting with the other, you can achieve a very clean arrangement where all the paths receive their own attention. And this is not only about footsteps, but also about groups of rooms, for instance. So here we see that these traces are nothing else than the surface occupied by different groups of rooms. And these are not only outcomes in terms of an analysis of the buildings, but also in terms of its rendering as an axonometric representation, for instance. Because here we see that what was previously characterized by this black fill now became an entire floor. So actually what is important to understand is that the trace is something through which these handbooks attempt to completely reconfigure the house arrangement. And this is not only about a human being making trace on a surface, but it's also about sunlight, for instance, that brings shadows inside. But it is also about furnitures. It is also about plumbings. It is also about other technical equipments and non-human beings, dogs and other animals, that by leaving trace into the house are able to reconfigure the house in view of the future developments. So we see from plan to trace. Now we see from plan to list. This is another kind of handbook that is unique in this genre of representation. Why? Because what he wants to do is to provide the representation of building with a very general appearance. And this kind of pie charts is perhaps the way by which he wants to achieve this goal. And how does it create this representation? Well, it doesn't start from scratch. You always start from a reference. This is the kind of typical hospital, so he starts from here. What he does, he starts to list all the rooms and all the other entities, also not only rooms, but also other entities that are related to that plan. It does not only list it, but also provides each one of these items with his own specific surface. Then the second step is that he divides this overall list into a set of categories, therefore into families of similar functions. And starting from these lists and this categorization, is then able to produce this pie chart representation. What is this pie chart outcome? It is nothing else than the most general representation of this typological one. Therefore, starting from this pie chart representation, the author wanted to stress that an architect would be able to achieve the most different architectural configurations. But such different multiplicities are somehow all related to the same diagram. Therefore, the diagram is nothing else than the most general representation of this kind of typology. From design to composition is another very important performance related to handbooks, since I think it allows us to overcome a certain bias towards academies. I'm very much convinced, by the way, that composition is not just something that is related to beauty, to achieve beautiful buildings. But I'm actually convinced that composition is something that allows architects to produce smart configurations, also in terms of logics, elegant, logical diagrams. I have started to realize this power of composition starting from this handbook, which is entitled The Elements of Composition of Civil Buildings. And I want to stress that the idea of composition that we see here, for instance, is nothing else than composition without rhetorics. Basically, what I want to stress is that in order to make composition relevant also in terms of how modern architecture is made, it is important to generalize the elements through which composition is made, which are actually three. The first is nothing else than the room, but the room can have whatever kind of shapes. It can be triangular, circular, whatever, square, whatever, but its most generic form is the circle. Then we have common passages, therefore enfilade or room aligned in order to make a path. So basically room you have to cross. You go from one room to another room. This is called common passage. And this is the typical object of architecture or element of architecture you find in the common fragments or parts of residential buildings, like the entrance, the hallway, and whatever. They are usually rooms that are placed into sequences, a room that you cross. And then the third element of composition is just something that works as a path, but you don't live there, you don't stay there. You just cross it in order to reach a certain room. But how are these elements combined together? And here it comes composition. These elements, the previous elements, are combined by means of axes. Axes are those devices that allow the elements of composition to achieve certain arrangements. This is one of the possible diagrams that we basically achieve by means of this sort of composition. What we have here is a monoaxial, a one-axis diagram. We see this is the private passage, therefore going back, it is this element here, you can recognize it, where all rooms are connected on the sides. This is, for instance, the most generalized representation of a notary office. Then we have other representations which are similar but not identical. This is, for instance, the diagram of a corporate office. And of course, it's a very generic representation of a corporate office, but it is embedded some kind of knowledge in it. And it is the kind of knowledge that allows the architects to produce or to achieve his final design. But the composition comes first. That's what I wanted to say. This is another example about a rational school. And you can also grow up and increase the amount of complexity of this diagram and achieve such sort of very complex, but at the same time very ordered, let's say, outcomes of buildings as very general shapes. So now, before we go to the exercise, I would take just 3 minutes in order to say that the kind of things I presented you today were part of my PhD, not only for my own scholarship, but also they resulted from an exchange with other students, and especially in Aachen, where we experimented with students in a seminar called Neufert Reloaded, the way through which all these old, let's say, diagrams could have been reenacted or reloaded in order to produce new configurations of different kind of programs that are considered, let's say, relevant nowadays. And then, of course, for those of you that are interested in this subject, this is actually my thesis, and I think this is online. And I think there you can, if you want to experience, to try to, let's say, understand how all these discourse about handbooks and stuff can produce effects, and how how diagrams are made starting from these traditions of handbooks. There you can really find all you need. And then the final advertisement, which is to me very important, is that we are trying to build a network. This is to discuss these subjects. And with this platform called Funes, we are trying to understand if these tools and this, let's say, knowledge that is very much related to the making of architecture can become a source of debate nowadays in order to provide architecture with an upgrade. So now we go to the exercise. I hope I was in time, but in order to sum up the whole thing I said in 2 sentences, I would say that first of all, I don't think handbooks are relevant in order to provide the buildings with a finite image, but rather to understand how buildings are made. And second is that handbooks allow the, let's say, transition from individual, therefore specific knowledge towards general and collective knowledge. So what this exercise will be about is exactly this process. So the question that is, and the hypothesis is that we can grasp general knowledge from specific projects, and in particular the project you did, one of the projects at least you did so far. And in order to do so, we will focus on plans. And the kind of plan that I want to start with is this one, that is the kind of example that I use in order to illustrate how the exercise can be undertaken. These are the 3 levels that constitutes Le Corbusier's house in La Plata. As you see here in this plan, this is the building. This is the model of the building. And here you see that inside the rooms were placed numbers, and each number refers to a specific room. So, this on the right side is the list of functions. In order to understand how this list was made, I use colors. So all the items that are the 7 items that are bounded in these green boundaries refer to the first floor, the ground floor. The red refers to the first floor, and the blue one refers to the second floor. Then, in order to generalize knowledge, I think it was a good idea. It is actually a good idea to use ready-made diagrams. Therefore, in the mirror board on which you will work, you will find a series of possible diagrams that were extracted from old handbooks. Here we see, for instance, 5, this here at the top, here we see 5 diagrams without numbers inside, because they have been erased. And among these 5 possible diagrams, but you will see more of them in the folder, but actually among these 5 that I took as examples, I eventually decided that this one, this second one, was perhaps the most suitable one in order to represent the previous plan. So, why I decided that this one was the right one? Simply because I started to look at these lines and say, okay, how was this diagram built and why? And perhaps, of course, I speculated a bit on it, and I realized that perhaps this kind of diagram could relate to a multi-floor arrangement. Therefore, I took it as a reference, and I placed all the items that that comes from the list inside this diagram. But in order to do this operation, I had to apply a certain logic. So first of all, I decided that all the circles on this side would be one floor, and the other would be perhaps another floor. But then, in order to make it work, therefore to find a certain correspondence between this diagram and this plan, I had to select the most distributive, or therefore connective items from the list. That is the ramp, for instance. You see the ramp here, item 7 and item 9. And I decided that perhaps this line could work as the ramp. Therefore, I placed the number 7, 9. And also other items like 17 and 10, therefore the landing and the entrance to the house, the patient's house. These 2 items could have been the other two distributive, let's say, therefore linear elements of the diagram. And starting from this logic, I could then rebuild the overall set of rooms by placing them in the circles. So once I constructed this, I basically filled this diagram with the list, the item from the list. Then, avanti, all right. Then the third step is to, in order to basically evaluate the true generality of this diagram, I wanted then to place these functions into the plan of the Maastricht Academy of Architecture, of Arts and Architecture, by Villaretz. So this is basically the school that is your school. So the idea is that starting from this diagram, we can reconceptualize another plan of whatever kind. This is just one of the possible reference we can use, but is perhaps the most conventional one. We can reconfigure the functional apparatus of another building, even though that building was not conceived, for instance, as a house. So how does this transposition works? You can recognize that this, for instance, Academie is based on 3 axes. We have 3 corridors. And perhaps these 3 corridors can refer to the lines, therefore, to the 3, 1 in red, 2 in blue, and 3 in green, families of functions of La Plata's building. And to sum up the overall process, then into a singular board, I placed all the elements, the ingredients that by which I undertook the exercise. So this is more or less it. But just one more thing before we end up and go to the Miro board, is that it was very important for me to realize that in order to make it feasible, to make such transformation feasible, really, the only necessary thing to me would be to create these 2 orange walls here. Just by building these 2 walls and closing these doors, we would have transformed the Maastricht Academy into the logical, general representation of La Plata's, Le Corbusier's house.
I see these diagrams of yours, very interesting. Thank you for your presentation, of course. But I see those diagrams in the program of requirements before the designer process. So how do you see your diagram? Can they used also before the designing process, or are they mostly used after to look back at your design?
No, this is of course a very good question. Actually, to me, these diagrams come before. They are tools to make design. I have to say that, to be honest, I don't think that intuitions is the true way by which architects make their own things. So they always start, as architects, we always start from a background of references, a background of sources or whatever. Tools, are nothing else than techniques that allows ourselves to grasp knowledge, to grasp images, to grasp whatever from these sources and make new things. And I think that the diagram is perhaps one way through which we grasp general things from specific sources. This is precisely why I like and why I relate this diagram to the handbook culture, because of this production of general knowledge.